So our first speaker today is Raymond Ibrahim, who also was a moderator yesterday. Many of you know him as an author, a specialist in Islam. Has written quite a few books, with the last one, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam, The Sword and Siptamar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, and Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. And you got to start with the Al-Qaeda reader. From working in the Library of Congress to now teaching classes, including the U.S. Army War College. He's briefed governmental agencies such as the U.S. Strategic Command, testified before Congress, as well as in a few other countries, spoken to legislators and their national assemblies. He is currently the Distinguished Senior Shulman Fellow at the Gatestone Institute and the Rosen Fellow at the Middle East Forum. So with that, please welcome Raymond Ibrahim.
Thanks, Lindsay, and good to see you all again. Good morning. Which is is this the one? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So what I'd like to discuss a little bit now is it's actually, 10 years ago in 2013, another major thing happened that impacted the Copts, aside from Lindsay joining CS. And that was basically the revolution in Egypt that brought Sisi to power. And, I wanted to discuss that because it's been 10 years. It's actually in the summer. I believe August 14, you can mark that as the date that really underscores the Copts' situation with Sisi in 2013. So what happened to them? If you recall, of course, the Copts gave their support to Sisi. And it's also interesting because while they get blamed for that, people forget that almost all the Egyptians were in the streets also rooting for Sisi. But for some reason, the Copts, apparently for those who would like to scapegoat them, make it sound like they played an extra supportive role. That ended up, of course, with 83 churches being attacked and burned in 2013 by Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers and so forth, because that revolution saw Mohammed Morsi ousted, of course. What those churches, what happened now? It's been 10 years. Apparently, many of them have actually been fixed, but does that mean the situation has gotten better for Copts, including, if not especially, in the context of churches? And we'll be discussing that for a little bit. The big question really is Sisi good for the Copts or not? And it depends on who you ask. I think if you ask your average Copt, they will say he is. And I think what we should be talking about is exploring why that is, why they say that. I think for starters, one of the things that Sisi's good at is talking. He's a good talker, and he says a lot of things that people want to hear. I personally was impressed. I think in 2014 he made a speech and he said, Islam, there's problems in it, we need to do something. And it sounds good, it sounds plausible. He does things like he goes to the churches and congratulates the Pope and so forth, and they seem to be best friends. So obviously on the surface, it seems good and beneficial to the Copts, and a lot of Copts think so. But there's a different current also. So under Sisi, for example, more churches have burned than before Sisi, believe it or not. Burned specifically, whereas churches were attacked during, of course, Morsi and Mubarak and Sadat. The phenomena of burning churches has become sort of exclusive, or mostly under Sisi. And I think one of the reasons is because the burnings appear to be an act of God or a natural act. It's not arson necessarily. We've seen so many churches recently burn. I think in 1 month, 11 caught fire. I think last summer, and it's rather suspicious to say that this is just faulty wires, the way they say. It's also important to emphasize that one theory is people are burning them, Ikhwan type Muslim Brotherhood or whatever. And the other official claim is that they're being burned because of poor wiring, overload on energy, there are fire hazards. But even if that latter reason is true, and there's reason to believe it, that still blames the Egyptian government, because that's tied up to all of the strictures that we sort of discussed yesterday that are part of the second-class citizenship of Copts. You can't build churches, you can't fix them, you can't renovate them. And because you can't do that, the current churches are basically fire hazards. I forget the name of the one. I think it was St. Mary that burned, and I think 40 people died. It was less than a year ago during that fire. Well, that wasn't even a church. It was a 2-story building that somehow was connected, and it was a makeshift church. So that sort of explains to you why that. The point is, either way, whether it's the Islamic Brotherhood types or whether it's just negligence, ultimately the government has to be held responsible for that, and many do. What about churches? So, of course, we know there's always a dearth of churches in Egypt. If you do, Megdi, I know, is an expert. He can give you all the numbers as far as how many churches vis-a-vis Copts. But the disparity is amazing. So, for example, it's my understanding that under Sisi, 55 new churches were built in 10 years, averaging about 5 churches a year or so. But that's actually similar to under Mubarak. So it's not anything unprecedented or very impressive. And most of these churches aren't actually where they belong. You need churches, the churches where Copts need them are usually in the small villages in Upper Egypt and in these areas, and they're very crowded and they have to travel far. But the churches that are being built are oftentimes for show, and they bring, the government brings foreigners to visit them. And I know one of them's out in the desert. Barely anyone can even really go visit it, including Copts. So much of it seems to be for show. But even the number, 55 churches in 10 years, at the same time, under Sisi, 10,800 mosques were built. Now, the Coptic population is at 15%, and that's what the Pope recently said, and it sounds like a plausible number based on the registries and baptismals and all that. If they're 15%, and I think the population of Egypt's a little over 100 million, so we're talking 15 million people, and they get 55 churches in 10 years, and then you get 10,800 mosques. So obviously the number, if you do the ratio, it's something like 1 to, 100. And so it's obviously very unjust in that sense. What about the overall situation for Copts outside of churches? And by the way, I always like to look at churches and focus on churches. I follow the topic of persecution of Christians, and I've always found churches are sort of a litmus test to what's going on. To me, attacks on churches or bans on churches are often more telling than attacks on Christians. And the reason for that is if a Muslim attacks a Christian, there could be a personal reason behind it, some sort of animosity, okay? But when you attack an inanimate building or you break a cross, I think that really underscores the animosity for Christianity in a way that other attacks don't. So that's why I often like to focus, and attacks on churches, really not just Egypt, but all throughout the Islamic world, and increasingly the non-Islamic world, is really getting bad in that context. But putting churches aside, and before I move on, and I think this is an interesting anecdote that's connected to everything, but it also brings in American perceptions. So as you know, in the United States, it's become popular to disavow the U.S. history because it's racist, it's full of slavery, it's horrible. And you saw, I think a couple of years ago, so many statues and monuments to American heroes, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, even Abraham Lincoln, get attacked, toppled, and so forth because they're bad people. Okay, leave that as it is. So in Egypt, I think 1 week ago, Egypt and Kazakhstan spent something like 600 million Egyptian pounds to renovate a mosque to a sultan, who his name is Baybars, a Mamluk sultan. And what did this sultan do? Well, he did certain things, obviously, that are important in Islamic history, but he also used to burn Christians, Copts alive, and behead them, Jews as well, force them to convert, destroy churches, throw them in pits and light them on fire. Okay, so this, just to give you an idea of the sorts of heroes that are being venerated and having mosques named for and dedicated to. And then if you compare that, just to show you the very different mentality in what's going on in Egypt with, let's say, America, which is attacking its heroes, who, if you compare them to someone like Baybars, no matter what their crimes, honestly appear like saints. At any rate, moving away from the churches, what about the overall situation for the Copts? So you still see a lot of the same sorts of things that you saw before, Sisi, specifically the impunity. So if you're a Muslim and you attack a Copt in whatever capacity, It's, and again, this goes, it goes back to Islamic law and Sharia and so forth, even though the law says everyone's equal, regardless of religion. As we saw, Article 2, overriding principle is the principles of Sharia are actually what the legislation is drawn from. And obviously, because Copts are second-class citizens, you still have so much impunity. We saw the example of the woman, the grandmother, Suad Thabit, I believe is her name, who's almost probably 80 right now, who was stripped naked, beaten, hauled around in the streets, spat at, called whatever, because her son had apparently broken another Sharia infraction, dating a Muslim woman, or being accused of it. And so collective punishment, and all the people who attacked her got off scot-free. I mean, that's, of course, usual and normal. We discussed a little bit about baby Shenouda, as he's known, who spent 5 years being raised by a Coptic family, but again, based on some rather bizarre Islamic stipulation that says everyone's a born Muslim, he was stripped away, put in an orphan, given back recently after so much, including international pressure, or not pressure, at least bad publicity, but it's still not over. It's all provisional, so we don't know. I think it was just done to shut people up, I think, at that point. The person of Sisi, again, if you ask certain Copts, as I said, I think he's a very good speaker, a manipulator, and he uses very good language, but he also uses, surprisingly, some of the most Islamist language of any president in Egypt. For someone who appears to be so supposedly pro or supportive of the Copts, his language is very, as we saw, he's part of the dedication to this mosque to a man who burned Copts alive. Okay, but the propaganda in Egypt is also really extreme in the pro-Sisi, and you either are on that side or you're either with it or against it. And I think that's the context to understand the situation of the Coptic Church, because the Coptic Church, of course, officially is with Sisi, officially says there's no real problems going on. And in many ways, this is the perfect hostage mentality. This is what dhimmis are historically. This is not just the Copts. Any Jews or Christians, the leadership had to really toe the line of the Islamic rulers or else. So there's a lot of fear involved. And this is not to say that some of them are not exploiting it for themselves as well. So it's a very murky situation. But, whoever has eyes to see can see that the situation really has not improved. To me, because I am interested in history, what really gets me is the continuity. So none of the things that I've mentioned have not happened constantly throughout Egyptian history. All you need to do is get Adil Gindi's excellent book, A Sword Over the Nile, which chronicles from the entrance of Islam, the Arabian conquest in the 7th century up until now. And it's just page after page of the same sorts of things, okay? You flip around, and regardless of which dynasty we're talking about, the Mamluks, or the Ottomans, or the Arabs, or the Umayyads, or the Abbasids, or so forth, you're going to see churches being attacked, the rabble rising up, burning them. One sultan is good, or he doesn't care, he's apathetic. Others attack and demonize the Copts, and they get killed and forced and so forth, forced to convert, and their women and children enslaved. So I think that's the most dismal aspect of what I'm talking about, this unwavering continuity. Because if you just look at what's happening right now in a sort of micro prism, a small view, you can say, okay, things have gotten bad, but they could get, possibly be ameliorated. But if you look at it from the long view, we're just seeing a continuation of something that has not really changed. And I think that's unfortunate. Obviously, there's ups and downs depending on the ruler, as I mentioned. So basically, I think, one of the most symbolic ways to see it is the Copts sided with Sisi 10 years ago. And as a result, 83 churches were burned. And a lot of words have been spoken since then, a lot of them good. But in the end result, churches are still burning, specifically, more than ever, under Sisi. We just, as I mentioned, 11 in 1 month, but even very recently, an ancient monastery caught fire. And one of them, I even saw, there's a video of it, surveillance video, and you just see a candle suddenly light up. So it's amazing. It's very curious for so many churches to keep catching fire, but I think it's symbolic of the plight of the Copts under Sisi, but also in general under, one Islamic dynasty after another. Anyway, I'll end it with that, and happy to take any questions. Thank you. Are you giving me papers or? Oh. Okay. In your studies and vision, you do not see a better action toward Copts in the Sisi era? Again, the ruler is the ruler, Sisi is Sisi. I don't know his mind, I don't know what he wants. He claims to be a serious Muslim, I believe that, at least to a certain extent. I believe, he'll use the Copts if they're helpful to him and useful to him, and he'll give them some token. They had 55 churches in 10 years, okay? It's still nothing compared to what they need. But I think Sisi is a very enigmatic figure because more than any other modern day Egyptian president, he seems to be very polarizing. So you have a lot of Copts till this day who will swear by him. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some in this room and say that he's a great president. And then there's others who think he's the absolutely worst thing to ever happen to the Copts. And I think that really just speaks to his sort of ambiguity, and which I think is intentional and tailored. Okay, I have another question. In the Egyptian government, there should be a
constitution.
Well, it says there should be a department that with discrimination, but this was, I think the question is, did you write it?
In the constitution, there is a point that they have to form a non-defense for discrimination. This is committee supposed to be done by the constitution, but it is still ignored.
Okay, so you're saying in the Egyptian constitution there's a provision that a committee for anti-discrimination should be formed, but it still has not been formed?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's not a question. I see what you're saying. It's just more of a reflection of what we're discussing, which is basically a sort of.
We have to get pressure to form this.
Yeah. I agree. Yes.
We believe that the problem of the whole Middle East is Islamic extremism, which got first when we had the revolution in Iran, 1979. Islamic Brotherhood or Hamas or Hezbollah, one of these fanatic organizations, they are all get financed by the Iranian government. And we believe that nothing in Middle East is really changed from the roots. As long as the head of the state in which Iranian government is still in power. How do you see the relationship between this Iranian government and Islamic Brotherhood?
Well, honestly, I hear a lot about Iran, but I don't think Egypt needs anything from Iran to be radical. My understanding is Egypt is probably the most radical nation as far as disseminating radical thoughts and preachers. I know Megdi has numbers about that, and they recently did an episode, but of all the Islamic worlds, actually the most radicalization is homegrown from Egypt. And of course, Iran is Shia, so it's not, if any country would probably, and it used to, though not as much now, was Saudi Arabia, because they're Sunnis like Egypt. But I think your bigger question is the role of Islam in general and Islamic extremism, and obviously that is the issue, of course, but the problem is, especially in the Western world, you can't really talk that way because they don't want to hear a religion is a problem or whatever. But it's really an ideology, and in this ideology, you have woven into it inherent discrimination, obviously, as we discussed yesterday in all these different Islamic scriptures and hadith and the conditions of Omar, where non-Muslims are at best second-class citizens. And I think that's what makes it a very insurmountable obstacle, because it's part of the faith. It's not tied up. So for example, a lot of people will, if you look at the worst nations to be a Christian, where there's a lot of Christian persecution, obviously if Open Doors usually publishes what's called the World Watch List, and they have the top 50 worst nations to be a Christian in. something like 38, if you do the number, are Muslim nations, okay? But the very worst nation is North Korea, okay? But actually, there's a light under the tunnel, because in North Korea, all that has to happen is the dictator goes, and it could completely change overnight. Look at South Korea. It's not part of the culture. In the Islamic world, unfortunately, it's part of the culture. And this is why you see the same patterns of attacks on churches, on Christians in general, on females, the same patterns that we see it in sub-Saharan Africa, we see it in the Arab nations, in Iran, in Philippines, Indonesia. So that's what makes it more existentialist and problematic. And until Western governments especially learn to incorporate the topic of Islam, I think it's a dead end, unfortunately. Someone gave me a question right here. Oh, okay. Okay. What about Al-Azhar, who is controlling Muslims' mentality, and nobody questions them, even Sisi? Okay, so yeah, Al-Azhar, as you know, is the considered in not just Egypt, but really the Islamic world, one of the most prestigious schools and universities. And they teach, if you really dig into it, they teach the same sort of things that Daesh or ISIS teach. And that's because ISIS doesn't teach it because it's ISIS, and Al-Azhar doesn't teach it because it's Al-Azhar. They teach it because it's in the Quran, and it's in the Sunnah, it's in the Hadith. So obviously Al-Azhar, if you look at it, and there's been multiple reports from alumni, graduates from Al-Azhar, who have shown you the same sorts of texts that ISIS uses, including burning people alive. I remember seeing that specifically, treating the non-Muslim, the Copt, the Jew, whoever, as a dhimmi, taking jizya from them, not telling them salam, pushing them against the wall because that's what Muhammad said to do, and so forth. So this is the issue. If an Islamic institution is true to the text of Islam, it's going to be, by definition, radical. Okay. What do you think of Sisi's actions regarding the 21 Coptic martyrs of ISIS, bringing back the bodies for burial, allowing their friends who was martyred with them, Matthew, to be brought to Egypt and buried for them? Yeah, see, so that's another good example. That's very good, right? Is it for show? Possibly, probably, depending on who you ask. But in and of itself, it's a good move, and it makes Copts like him. It makes Western observers think he's, a neutral or egalitarian-minded president who cares about all of his citizens. But in the end, it's ultimately just a move. It could be a publicity stunt. And this is the issue, because it's good that he did that. I wouldn't argue with that. But at the same time, the actual suffering of the Copts, let's go back to the issue of no churches. In Upper Egypt, so many Copts just don't have a church. They're denied. They have to either walk miles, and there's no transportation, or they have to enter and it's completely crowded, and then they fall apart and burn and people die, as we've seen. So that would seem to be a more useful, practical, and sincere way to help the Copts, as opposed to these sorts of token gestures. All right, I can't read this, my eyes. Okay. Is this yours? Yeah? Okay. Whoever wrote these last two can just ask me. Okay? Go ahead.
We know that Sisi ran last time without a program. If he decided in his claim coming year elections to come up with a program, what do you like to see in his program concerning the right of the Copts to be defended against the fundamentalism and racism against them?
Well, idealistically, theoretically, but I don't expect this to happen, I would obviously like to see Article 2 of the Constitution revised. Because this is the number one, this is the pinnacle, everything's built on that. As long as that stands, everything else is just words. Even if it was to be brought back to the way it was, because it used to be Islamic Sharia was a principle of legislation. Now it's become the principle. So even if you were to change it back to A, that might be helpful. But other than that, it's just, because it's this hidden clause that overrides everything. Okay? As I mentioned yesterday, in the actual constitution, it sounds great. Everyone's equal, religion is not a part of it. But then because of that principle, they're not equal in practice. Okay, the last question? Or
How do you see the way out from under Sisi?
I don't think it's something the Copts are going to do, let's put it this way. It would require, I suppose, another revolution, but I don't even know if that would work because he controls the military. Sisi is a very adroit politician, and he's also a military man, so he really has two backgrounds that make him formidable and not easily ejected, as opposed to just a politician or a Muslim Brotherhood character. He's embedded with the military and the intelligence services and so forth. So getting rid of him, I don't think it's certainly not something the Copts are going to do, and I suggest they don't try to do it, because then they will be scapegoated once again, this time for being against him. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
But I was wondering how much influence does Sisi have on Azhar, and how susceptible is he from outside pressure to be able to influence him if he wants? Is it just?
I mean, he's the supreme leader of Egypt. I imagine he can, if he wants, to do anything with Al-Azhar. And he, on the surface, I think he makes it sound like he's urging them. But I think deep down inside, he's not going to, force them to do anything, because we would have seen it. I mean, Al-Azhar is still part of Egypt. It's not part of the Islamic world. It's governed by Egypt. So that's actually another example, because he made that good speech in 2014 to Al-Azhar, but nothing has changed. And then later I even saw Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Grand Mufti, almost mocking what he didn't mock it, but it was just kind of like, okay, sounds good, but Islam is Islam. So, okay. Yes?
You mentioned that more churches was
You're next, okay.
more churches was burned in Sisi's era than the others. Do we have any records of how many Christians got killed in 10 years of Sisi versus Mubarak or Sadat?
Yeah, Megdi's, do you have any figures? Megdi's the number man.
There is a lot of bombs in churches under Sisi, especially in the first 5 years. But we don't accuse him that it's against all people, but targeted churches. If you calculate the numbers, yes, the number increased in the 5 years of Sisi era more than Mubarak era, of course.
Increase in killing
But in
wives
the,
for the Copts?
yeah, that's,
But
in the last 5 years, it decreased. The number decreased.
Okay, so the first 5 years it jumped, now it went back down. Okay. Yes?
We see a contrast between how he deals with Salafists and Bedouin Salafists, even allowing 8 political parties based on religious, one of them is the Noor party, with the contrast of the constitution that forbade establishing a political party based on religion. That's one hand, and leaving the Salafist media attacking Copts and Christian and all time. At the same time, he talked some nice talk about secular state, about freedom and religion and stuff. This talk just directed to the West and other nations only.
To a great extent, I think whenever I hear a Muslim politician speak, there's two sets of speeches: Western audience and fellow Muslims. I mean, this is well known. We are privileged that we can understand this because we speak Arabic. Your average Westerner has no idea. But the best example is Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib. I've seen him, he goes and hugs Pope Francis, and they're best friends, and we're brothers. And then he starts talking about, if you're an apostate, you should be killed. Ahl al-Dhimma and all that sort of thing. So all of them, I think it's become second nature to have the two faces depending on who they're talking to. Are these new questions? Can I just whoever's writing these ask me? I can't read. It's my eye. I don't have my reading glasses. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to read them, and you can tell. Is Coptic Solidarity's voice heard? Lindsay, you want to answer that, or Megdi?
Lindsay.
Sure, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects, right, of how well we're heard. But I would say that our voice is very steadily growing. We definitely have much more recognition than when the organization started. We still have a long ways to go. I think that I talked yesterday about the independence from the church, independence from the government, which is the key to Coptic Solidarity's success. And when we applied for our UN status, I didn't share this yesterday, but you don't get a vote. There has to be unanimous agreement from that committee that reviews your applications. All you need is one country who does not want your organization to get status, and they will talk to another country on the committee that's their friend, and they just use these procedures to block you. In our case, it was Egypt, Pakistan. So Pakistan, Coptic Solidarity is a red line. We cannot let them get their ECOSOC status with the UN. Pakistani delegate tells me this without shame. So I think if you want to know, is our voice heard? Yes. The Egyptian government says Coptic Solidarity is a red line that we can't cross. We do not want them to be increasing their voice, to be more effective. That's just one example.
Yeah, one thing I can also add to it is because I do a lot of online researching, and one interesting phenomena, if you don't know about it, there's something called shadow banning, where basically the internet, my website, for example, if you Google something, it used to be, if you put a topic, I'll come up on my website. Now you won't even see it. It's gone. It's on my website, but the search engine won't show it. Coptic Solidarity, anything that pops up on Coptic Solidarity, you will not find it. It's even worse. So there's something going on where they are in the algorithms completely hiding Coptic Solidarity. I can tell you that because I've looked for articles that we've written. I can't even find them anymore unless I go to the website. All right, why is the U.S. silent? Not only about the situation in Egypt, but also Nigeria, Iraq, Sudan, and other countries. Well, I think because the United States doesn't care about human rights at all. Human rights are a pretext. They're useful when they're useful. So if the United States wants to side Ukraine against Russia, it will talk about human rights. It will say that's why we're doing it, because Ukrainians are suffering and it's not fair. But that's not why they're doing it, because if they really did care, as this question says, they would be in a lot of different countries right now, saving a lot of people who are being butchered left and right. So ultimately, I don't think the United States, or really many other countries, care about human rights. That's just a pretext to help their narrative whenever they have an agenda to go to war. All right. Is there a non-dependent Coptic entity, an assembly inside Egypt or out, other than Coptic Solidarity, that is raising the voices against these attacks? Megdi, I don't think so. Anything outside of the church?
Inside Egypt?
Yeah, inside.
No. Inside Egypt,
No. No.
Or outside?
It wouldn't be tolerated, I don't think.
Or even outside? Is there any outside?
I know, they would know. Do you have competitors?
No real.
Okay.
No one that's not being very obviously influenced by the church or the government.
Okay. I think this is the last question. When do you think it will be the right time for all church leaders inside Egypt from all denominations to stand up against the aggressive actions against the Copts? Probably never. I get this question often about Christians under Muslims who are being persecuted, and people tell me, why don't Christians arm themselves and fight back? Well, I think that would be a death sentence, especially in Egypt, because a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood types already accuse the Copts of trying to create an independent state, and that their churches and their mosques are full of weapons. They're basically projecting what they do onto the Copts. And that already inflames a lot of Muslims. So can you imagine if Christians actually held guns and said, we're going to defend ourselves? It'll go from 10-15% of extremists attacking them to all the Muslims attacking them, including the government. So unfortunately, I don't think that's a viable way out. I appreciate and sympathize with the sentiment itself, but I don't think it would lead to anything except making it worse for the Copts. Okay, last question.
Okay, I think that you're mainly talking about the Sisi, although he's one governing whole Muslim brother country, just putting aside the Copts.
Mm.
And I'm not with the Sisi or with anybody, but just from what I can see is why don't Coptic solidarity? We can see that the head of the church is giving false information or whatever he says that he's okay, he's being treated well with the Sisi government and everything. Why doesn't Coptic solidarity work with the Pope in order to get what the Copts want in Egypt from the Sisi? Because if we are attacking the Sisi and then comes the Muslim Brothers back again, that will be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
From what I can see is the best choice for the church at the moment is the Sisi. If you think he's a Muslim extremist, then this is another thing. But
Okay.
from what I can see is if the Coptic solidarity works with the Pope in order to get what the Copts need in Egypt through the church, through the to reach the Sisi, better than we're attacking the Sisi. And because most of the
Right.
Azhar, everything is.
My understanding is that the Coptic Church is allied with Sisi, okay, and the Coptic Church is formally a religious organization. Coptic Solidarity is a secular organization, and I don't. Someone else can speak much better about this than I can on that table, but I'm pretty sure that anything that Coptic Solidarity says or requests or requires of the church will probably be turned down because it would be deemed too aggressive, too critical of Sisi, and the church wants to be in his good graces, or at least doesn't want to, offend him and rock the boat for the reasons that you sort of indicate. So, Coptic Solidarity is a secular Western organization that doesn't have to worry about Sisi. The Coptic Church is in Egypt and has to deal with Sisi, and so it makes communications and cooperation between CS and the Coptic Church, I think, a little difficult. And anyone here can elaborate. Okay? All right, thank you.